My daughter told me I couldn't see my grandkids anymore unless I paid her mortgage, so I looked at their photos, sent the money, and let her think she'd won. She doesn't know that I didn't just pay a bill, I bought her entire mortgage from the bank. And now, I'm about to call in the loan. Before we dive into this intense story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We'd also love to know where you're all tuning in from. Let us know in the comments. The silence in my house had become a character of its own since my wife Helen passed away 3 years ago. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a weighted one, filled with the echoes of laughter, the phantom scent of her rose perfume, and the faint hum of a life that was no longer there. At 58, I was navigating the quiet waters of retirement, a life I had meticulously planned for as an architect, yet one I felt wholly unprepared for without her. My only anchors, my only true sources of unfiltered joy, were my grandchildren, Ava and Noah. Their crayon drawings were the only new additions to the refrigerator door, vibrant bursts of color amid the faded photos of a life fully lived. I was looking at one of those drawings, a wobbly portrait of a smiling stick figure with wild gray hair labeled Grandpa, when my phone rang. It was my daughter, Clara. My heart gave a familiar, pleasant leap. We had a standing arrangement. I would visit every Wednesday and Saturday to watch the kids. Perhaps she was calling to add an extra day. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, my voice warm. "Hi, Dad." Her tone was flat, not cold, not yet, but devoid of the usual warmth. It was the sterile, efficient voice she used for work calls. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. "Is everything all right?" I asked. There was a pause, and I could hear the faint, muffled sound of someone whispering in the background. It had to be her husband, Mark. "Dad, we need to talk about your visits," she said, her voice now strained, as if reading from a script. "Okay," I said slowly, sinking into my armchair. "What about them?" "Well, things are a bit tight right now," she began, the rehearsed nature of her words becoming more obvious. "Mark and I have been looking at our finances, and it's a lot. The cost of everything is going up." I waited, unsure where this was leading. I had always been generous with Clara. Helen and I had paid for her college, helped with a down payment on her first car, and given her and Mark a substantial check for their wedding. We never wanted our daughter to struggle. "I understand that, Clara. Is there something I can do to help?" I asked, my mind already running through possibilities. Maybe they needed a new water heater, or perhaps the car needed repairs. Then came the blow. It was delivered without ceremony, a blunt instrument of a sentence. "We can't afford to have you see the grandkids anymore," she said. The silence that followed was different. This wasn't the quiet echo of memories. This was the deafening roar of a vacuum, sucking all the air and warmth from the room. I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white. What did you say?" "We can't afford it," she repeated, her voice gaining a brittle edge of defensiveness. Unless you're willing to help us out with the mortgage." I was speechless. It felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. She wasn't asking for help. She was delivering an ultimatum. My access to the two most precious people in my life was being held for ransom. "The mortgage," I finally managed to say, my voice raspy. "Clara, what are you talking about? Your mortgage is—" I stopped myself. I knew exactly what their mortgage was. I also knew what they paid for their two luxury cars, their designer clothes, and their weekly dinners at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than my weekly groceries. "We need help, Dad," she insisted. "If you could just cover the payment each month, it would free things up for us. Then, of course, you could continue to see Ava and Noah just like always." Just like always, the phrase was a cruel twist of the knife. Nothing would ever be the same. The innocence of my relationship with my grandchildren, the pure love I felt for them, was now being monetized. It was being turned into a transaction, a fee for service. I looked across the room at the framed photo of Helen on the mantelpiece. Her smiling eyes seemed to look back at me, full of a disbelief that mirrored my own. I could hear Mark whispering again, more urgently this time. Clara's voice hardened. "So that's the deal, Dad. Let us know what you decide." The line went dead. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone screaming in the abyss she had created between us. It wasn't a request for help, it was a ransom note. And the betrayal was worse than any financial hardship could ever be. The hours after that phone call were a blues. Hour of quiet agony. I walked through my home, each room a museum of a happy life that felt like a distant country. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink. I opened a book I didn't read. My mind was a frantic storm of grief and anger, replaying Clara's words over and over again. "We can't afford to have you see the grandkids anymore." It was a masterfully cruel phrase, designed to inflict maximum pain by wrapping a threat in the language of financial necessity. My gaze kept returning to the refrigerator, to the gallery of my grandchildren's lives. Ava's first day of school, her toothless grin beaming with pride. Noah as a chubby toddler covered head to toe in mud from the garden. Each photo was a testament to the love and time I had poured into their lives, moments that I had believed were built on a foundation of family, not finance. The thought of being cut off from them was a physical pain, a phantom limb aching for a connection that had been surgically, callously severed. After what felt like an eternity, I picked up the phone and called her back. I had to try to appeal to the daughter I thought I knew, the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read her stories. She answered on the second ring. "Have you thought about it?" she asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Clara, please," I begged, my own voice cracking. "Please don't do this, this isn't you. If you're in trouble, real trouble, you know I'll help you. We can sit down, go over the numbers, we can make a plan, but this is not the way." "Mark says this is the only way," she replied, and in that moment I knew this wasn't my daughter's plan. The architect of this cruelty was my son-in-law. Mark, the smooth-talking financial advisor who viewed the world not in terms of relationships but of assets and liabilities. To him, I was no longer a father-in-law, I was an untapped asset. "So you're choosing to use your own children as leverage?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "It's not like that," she snapped, a flash of her old self breaking through. "We're just trying to provide for our family, you wouldn't understand." I wouldn't understand. I who had worked 60-hour weeks for 30 years to provide for my family, I who had built our family home with my own two hands, the sheer audacity of the statement left me breathless. I realized then that reasoning with her was futile. She was too deep inside Mark's web of toxic logic. A cold calm washed over me, displacing the hot anger. It was the focus I used to get when faced with a complex architectural problem, a sense of clarity that emerged from chaos. I had to play the game to win, and I had to win for Ava and for Noah. "Fine," I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Fine, you win. I'll transfer the money for this month. Send me the details." I could hear her sigh of relief, a sound that twisted the knife in my gut. "Oh, thank you, Dad. I knew you'd understand. I'll text you the account information right now. I'll tell the kids you're coming on Saturday." She hung up, her mission accomplished. She believed she had me backed into a corner, a desperate old man willing to pay any price. She and Mark would be celebrating their victory, confident in their power over me. But as I stood there in the crushing silence of my home, a new thought began to take shape, a blueprint for a different kind of structure. They think this is about money. They've forgotten what I do for a living. I build things, and I also understand how to deconstruct them piece by piece. The roots of this betrayal, I realized, ran deeper than a single phone call. They had been silently growing for years, watered by a potent mixture of entitlement and greed. My mind drifted back through time, searching for the moments where the path had diverged, where my loving daughter had started to transform into this cold, transactional stranger. Helen and I had raised Clara to be kind, compassionate, and independent. We believed in giving her every opportunity, not to spoil her but to empower her. When she chose a university on the other side of the country, we didn't hesitate. We paid her tuition, her living expenses, and flew to see her every holiday, our hearts swelling with pride at her ambition. We never saw it as a debt to be repaid, it was simply what parents did. Her happiness was our dividend. The first subtle shift occurred when she met Mark. On the surface, he was everything a parent could want. He was handsome, dressed in impeccably tailored suits, and possessed a charisma that could charm a statue. He was a financial advisor, a profession that suggested stability and wisdom, but even from the beginning I felt a dissonance between his polished exterior and what lay beneath. His smile never quite reached his eyes. His eyes were constantly scanning, assessing. When he looked at our home, he didn't see the place where his future wife grew up. He saw square footage and property value. I remember one Sunday dinner, not long after they were engaged. I was talking about a community project I was volunteering for, designing a small park for a low-income neighborhood. Mark had listened with a bemused smirk. "That's very noble, Thomas," he'd said, swirling the wine in his glass. "But what's the return on investment? You've got all this expertise. You could be consulting for major developers pulling in 7 figures. "The return," I had replied calmly, "is a place for children to play. Some things aren't measured in dollars, Mark." He had laughed it off, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Well, you can't pay a mortgage with a slide and a swing set." He then winked at Clara. "Good thing we've got access to your dad's much deeper pockets, eh?" Clara had laughed along with him a little nervously and tapped his arm. At the time, I dismissed it as a tasteless joke, a sign of his generation's different perspective on wealth. Now I saw it for what it was, a declaration of intent. He had seen me as a resource from day one. He wasn't marrying a woman, he was acquiring a family with assets. Over the years, his influence over Clara became more pronounced. Their lifestyle began to inflate far beyond their means. There were lavish vacations documented on social media, a new luxury SUV every 2 years, and a constant parade of designer clothes and expensive gadgets. I'd occasionally caution Clara, gently suggesting they build a savings cushion, especially with the children. "Oh, Dad, don't worry," she would say, waving a dismissive hand. "Mark's got it all under control, he's a genius with this stuff." But I was an architect, I understood foundations, and the foundation of their life was built on sand. I saw the late payment notices they tried to hide when I visited, the way Mark would deflect any specific questions about his work with vague jargon about leveraging assets and aggressive growth strategies. He was a salesman, not a strategist, and he had sold my daughter a fantasy she desperately wanted to believe. He had isolated her from her own common sense, convincing her that their financial recklessness was a sign of success and that any obstacle could be overcome by tapping into the family bank. My bank. The ultimatum about the grandchildren wasn't a desperate, last-ditch effort. It was the next logical step in Mark's playbook. He had successfully convinced Clara that my love was a resource to be exploited, that her own father's heart was collateral for their extravagant life. He was the architect of this pain, and my daughter was his willing accomplice. For 2 days I let the silence in my house be my counsel. I grieved for the daughter I had lost and for the simple, trusting relationship I once had, but grief I knew was a passive state. It was time to shift from emotion to action. The architect in me took over, pushing the heartbroken father aside. Every great structure begins with a blueprint, and the plan forming in my mind was intricate, precise, and built to withstand any challenge. My first call wasn't to a bank, but to my oldest friend, David Sterling. David had been my lawyer and financial manager for over 30 years. He was a quiet, meticulous man who shared my belief in integrity and careful planning. He had managed the investments from the sale of my architectural firm, the nest egg that was now my retirement fund. "Thomas," he said, his voice a familiar comfort. "It's good to hear from you, everything okay?" "Not exactly, David," I said, and I laid it all out. The phone call, the ultimatum, the sickening realization of Mark's influence. I left out no detail. David listened patiently, the silence on his end punctuated only by the faint scratching of his pen. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The nerve," he finally said, his voice laced with a cold fury I rarely heard from him. "To use his own children as pawns, that man is not just a fool, he's a predator." "He is," I agreed, "and I refuse to be his prey." Clara texted me her mortgage details. She expects me to just send the monthly payment. "Which you will not be doing," David stated, already ahead of me. "No," I said, "I have a different idea. I want to buy the loan." David was silent again, but this time I could almost hear the gears turning in his sharp legal mind. "Buy the mortgage debt," he mused. "Take the bank's position as the lienholder. It's aggressive, Thomas, but it's brilliant. It turns their greatest asset into their greatest liability with you holding all the cards." "Is it possible?" "With your liquid assets and credit history, absolutely," David confirmed. "Banks are often happy to offload private mortgage debts, especially if they smell even a hint of trouble on the horizon. It removes the risk from their books. What's the outstanding amount?" I told him the figure, a staggering sum that reflected the overpriced house they had insisted on buying. "Leave it with me, David," said, his voice all business now. "I'll make some preliminary, discreet inquiries with their lender. I'll act as an agent for an anonymous investor. They don't need to know your name until the ink is dry." Process was surprisingly swift. As David had predicted, the bank was more than willing to negotiate. My investigation, aided by David's legal resources, uncovered what I had long suspected. Clara and Mark were already 2 months behind on their payments. Their file was likely heading toward the pre-foreclosure department. To the bank, my offer to buy the entire note at a very slight discount was a godsend. It was a clean, immediate solution to a problem that was only going to get worse. Within a week, the deal was in motion. I liquidated a portion of my portfolio, the funds transferred to an escrow account managed by David's firm. Documents were drawn up, clauses reviewed, and signatures prepared. While Clara and Mark waited for their monthly bailout, I was orchestrating a fundamental shift in their reality. I wasn't just patching a leak in their roof, I was buying the entire building. During this time, I maintained a facade of capitulation. I sent Clara a single mortgage payment via direct transfer, just as she demanded. She texted me moments after it arrived, "Got it. Thanks, Dad, see you Saturday." There was no gratitude, no hint of shame, just a simple confirmation that the transaction was complete. It was a cold, hard nail in the coffin of the relationship I thought we had, but I didn't let it sting. I was looking at the bigger picture now, at the structural integrity of the trap I was setting. As I signed the final document in David's office, a thick stack of papers that officially transferred ownership of my daughter's debt to me, I felt a grim sense of resolve. They had forgotten who I was. They saw me as a relic, an old man to be managed and milked. They had forgotten that an architect knows every stress point, every load-bearing wall, and every single weakness in a foundation. And their foundation was about to crumble. With the papers signed and the transaction complete, I was now, in the cold, hard language of the law, my daughter's creditor. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but they were blissfully unaware. The first part of my plan was complete. The second part required patience and a steady hand. I had to let them settle into their false sense of security. A week after I had wired the initial payment, I called Clara. I deliberately pitched my voice to sound gentle, even a little defeated, the loving father who had been forced to bend to his daughter's will. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "I was just calling to check in, and I wanted to let you know that I've taken care of the mortgage situation for you." "You have?" I could hear the surprise and sheer, unadulterated glee in her voice. "What do you mean? Did you pay off a few months in advance?" "Something like that," I said vaguely. "Let's just say I found a more permanent solution. You shouldn't have to worry about it for a while." There was a muffled sound, and then Mark's voice, slick and eager, was on the line. He must have snatched the phone from her. "Thomas, that's fantastic news. What did you do? Did you set up an automatic payment for the rest of the year?" Clara was just saying that would be the easiest way to manage it. The casual entitlement was breathtaking. He didn't even bother with a pretense of gratitude. He was already thinking about logistics, about how to make his newfound income stream more efficient. "No, nothing like that," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "It was a different kind of arrangement, more of a one-time thing, but it's all been resolved." "A one-time thing?" Mark pressed, a flicker of suspicion in his voice. "What do you mean, resolved? Did you pay off the whole thing?" The greed in his question was a tangible thing, a raw hunger that traveled through the phone line. Here was my opening, my first subtle reveal, not of the truth, but of the fact that I was now in control of the information. "Mark, you're a financial advisor," I said, a hint of steel entering my voice. "You know some arrangements are complex. All you and Clara need to know is that the lender has been satisfied. The matter is closed." "Which lender did you just send them a check?" he demanded. "It's handled," I said firmly, cutting him off. "I have to go now. I'll see you all on Saturday." I hung up before he could ask another question, leaving them in a state of confused excitement. I could picture the scene perfectly: Mark, frustrated by my vagueness but ecstatic at the prospect of a paid-off house. Clara, relieved that the conflict was over and that her access to my money was apparently secure. They would check their online mortgage portal, and what they would find would only confirm their wildest dreams. The account would show a balance of 0. The loan would be marked as paid and closed. Their assumption, of course, would be that I had simply paid the entire $500,000 debt out of the goodness of my heart. They would see it as the ultimate victory, proof that their hardball tactic had worked beyond their expectations. They wouldn't understand that a loan being closed with one lender simply means it's been moved. They wouldn't think to check the county records for a new lien holder. Why would they? In their minds, I was just the family ATM, not a strategic player. The first confrontation was over. I had revealed nothing, yet everything had changed. I had dangled the ultimate prize in front of them, and they had greedily snatched at the bait. They now believed they were free and clear, living in a house they owned outright. Their arrogance would swell. Their spending would increase. And when I finally chose to reveal the truth, their fall would be that much greater. As I predicted, the belief that they were mortgage-free sent Clara and Mark into a spiral of reckless euphoria. Their social media feeds, which I began monitoring with a kind of detached, anthropological curiosity, transformed into a showcase of their supposed newfound wealth. There were photos from a weekend trip to a luxury spa, posts about shopping sprees for designer handbags, and a long, gushing announcement about the dream kitchen renovation they had just booked. They were burning through money with a feverish intensity, as if to prove to the world and to themselves that they had truly made it. Every post was a fresh stab of confirmation. They felt no remorse, only a profound sense of entitlement. My gift wasn't a lifeline to be grateful for, it was a launchpad for an even more extravagant lifestyle. Meanwhile, my lawyer David was completing his due diligence. What he uncovered was far worse than I had imagined. Mark's professional life was a trail of scorched earth. He hadn't just made a few bad investments, he had a documented history of predatory behavior. David found a record of a lawsuit filed 2 years prior by a former business partner, a man named Abernathy. The court documents painted a grim picture. Mark had allegedly convinced Abernathy to drain his retirement savings for a guaranteed real estate venture, only for the money to vanish into a web of shell companies Mark controlled. The case had been settled out of court, with Mark likely signing a non-disclosure agreement, but the initial filings were a matter of public record. He wasn't just a bad financial advisor, he was a con artist. He had done to others what he was now doing to me and my daughter. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Clara wasn't just being manipulated by a greedy husband, she was the unknowing partner of a professional predator. The stakes were no longer just about teaching them a lesson. They were about saving my daughter from the man she had married. The time had come for the second confrontation. This one would be in person. I drove to their house on a Tuesday afternoon unannounced. Clara opened the door, surprised to see me. "Dad, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by," I lied smoothly. Mark appeared behind her, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered on his face. "Thomas, good to see you. Come on in. Can I get you a drink? We were just celebrating. The contracts for the kitchen are signed." "That's wonderful," I said, my voice dangerously calm. I sat on their plush new sofa, the one that still had the tags on it. "Actually, I came to talk about business. An investment opportunity, you might say." Mark's eyes lit up. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With the mortgage gone, he saw me as a source of fresh capital. "I'm all ears," he said, leaning forward eagerly. "I've got a few ventures myself that could use an injection of capital. Now that our primary overhead is eliminated, we're in a prime position for aggressive growth." I let him talk for a few minutes, letting him spin his web of financial jargon and empty promises. Then I made my move. "It's funny," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I was doing some research for my own portfolio and a name kept popping up that I found interesting. A Mr. Abernathy." The effect was instantaneous. Mark's charming facade didn't just crack, it shattered. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of panic. Clara looked from his face to mine, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Abernathy," she asked, "who's that?" Mark shot her a look, a silent, desperate plea for her to drop it, but I didn't give him the chance. "He's a former business partner of Mark's," I explained, my eyes locked on my son-in-law. "They had a fascinating real estate venture together. At least it was fascinating until Mr. Abernathy's entire retirement fund disappeared. The lawsuit made for some very compelling reading." "That was a misunderstanding," Mark stammered, his voice suddenly a full octave higher. "It was all settled, a clerical error." "Was it?" I asked, pulling a neatly folded document from my jacket pocket. It was a copy of the initial court filing. "Because this document doesn't mention a clerical error. It mentions fraud, breach of contract, and deliberate deception. It seems to be a pattern with you, Mark." I placed the papers on the coffee table between us. Clara stared at them, then at her husband's terrified face. For the first time, the perfect image she held of him was fracturing. The financial genius who was providing for her family was suddenly looking like a common thief. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what is this? What is he talking about?" Mark just sat there, sputtering, trying to formulate a lie that was big enough to cover the truth. But there were no words. I had presented irrefutable proof. I had laid the first charge in my case against him, not in a court of law, but in the court of his own home. The spell he had woven around my daughter was beginning to break. The final act was set. A week after the confrontation over the Abernathy lawsuit, I invited Clara and Mark to my house for a celebratory dinner. The pretense was to toast their new debt-free life and the start of their kitchen renovation. I told them it was time we put any awkwardness behind us and simply celebrated their good fortune as a family. Mark, desperate to regain his footing and restore his image, eagerly accepted. Clara's acceptance was more hesitant, her voice quiet and strained over the phone. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. I also invited one other guest, my lawyer David, whom I introduced simply as my oldest friend. They arrived right on time. Mark was back to his old self, dressed in a crisp shirt and oozing a confidence that was clearly forced. He brought an expensive bottle of champagne, holding it up like a trophy. Clara was a shadow beside him. She was pale, and her eyes, which darted nervously between me and her husband, were clouded with an anxiety she couldn't hide. We made it through dinner with strained small talk. Mark dominated the conversation, boasting about the contractor they'd hired and the top-of-the-line German appliances they had ordered. I let him talk, nodding and smiling, filling his glass whenever it was low. David remained quietly observant, a calming, judicial presence at the table. Finally, the plates were cleared. I stood up, holding my own glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," I began, the room falling silent. Mark beamed, ready to receive his tribute. "To family," I said, looking directly at Clara, "and to the importance of meeting one's financial obligations." Mark's smile faltered slightly. The toast was not what he expected. "Before we have dessert," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "there's one last piece of business to discuss regarding the house." I reached down and placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the polished wood of the dining table. I slid it across to them. "Dad, what's this?" Clara asked, her hand trembling as she reached for it. "You've been operating under a slight misunderstanding," I said calmly. "Mark, you asked if I had paid off your mortgage. The answer is no, I didn't pay it, I bought it." I let the words hang in the air. Mark stared at me, his face a canvas of confusion. "Bought it? What are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense." "It makes perfect sense," David interjected, speaking for the first time. "The bank that held your loan sold the entire promissory note and its security interest in your property to a new private lender. That new lender is your father-in-law." Clara opened the folder. Inside on top was the official notarized transfer of deed of trust, stamped by the county clerk's office. It clearly named me, Thomas Vance, as the sole lienholder on their property. Her gasp was a small, wounded sound. Mark snatched the papers from her, his eyes scanning them frantically. This can't be legal," he blustered, looking at David. "I assure you it is 100% legal and binding," David replied coolly. "Your original loan agreement contains a clause allowing for the sale of the debt. It's standard practice." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. "And that same agreement," I said, my voice dropping to a low, precise tone, "contains another clause, Section 7B. It states that upon a change in the ownership of the debt, the lender reserves the right to call the entire loan due in full. Mark, Clara, this is your official notice." I slid a second document from the folder, a formal letter drafted by David's firm. "You have 30 days to remit payment in full for the outstanding principal and interest. The total amount is $487,214.37. The room was utterly silent, the champagne bottle on the counter suddenly see. Amid obscene, Mark's face went from white to a blotchy, furious red. "You can't do this. This is our home. You're trying to ruin us." "Ruin you?" I echoed, my voice rising for the first time, sharp with the righteous anger I had held back for so long. "You tried to extort me. You used my grandchildren, your own children, as bargaining chips to fund your lifestyle. You stood by while your husband, a man who preys on people's life savings, convinced you to blackmail your own father. You didn't want help, you wanted a blank check. This isn't ruin, Mark. This is a consequence." All the fight drained out of him, replaced by a sputtering panic. But the true climax wasn't his defeat. It was Clara. She slowly raised her head, her eyes filled with a horrifying clarity. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at her husband. "You knew," she whispered, her voice shaking with a dawning rage. "You knew we were behind on payments. You told me we were fine. You told me to say those things to him, to my dad." "Clara, baby, he's twisting things," Mark began, reaching for her hand. She recoiled as if from a snake. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He's not. This whole time, the spa, the kitchen, you were spending his money. Money you got by threatening him with his own grandchildren." She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The look on her face was one of absolute betrayal, a realization so profound it seemed to remake her features. "You did this," she said, her voice now a powerful tremor of fury aimed directly at her husband. "You made me do this to my own father." In that moment, the spell wasn't just broken, it was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The aftermath of that dinner was swift and decisive. Mark's blustering threats quickly evaporated into pathetic, pleading phone calls which I directed to David. Faced with the ironclad legality of the situation and the irrefutable proof of his own manipulative behavior, he crumbled. He had no resources, no allies, and no way to conjure nearly $500,000. Within 2 weeks, his facade of success now a pathetic ruin, he packed a bag and left, abandoning Clara and the children to face the consequences he had orchestrated. His departure was not a tragedy, it was the necessary removal of a cancer. The foreclosure was a formality, an administrative process I managed with detached efficiency. The house, a monument to their greed, was sold within a month in a strong market. After my initial investment was recouped, a significant amount of equity remained. As I had planned, I worked with David to place every last cent of it into a tightly controlled trust fund for Ava and Noah. It would be there for their education, their first homes, their futures, a legacy from their grandfather, completely firewalled from their mother's reach until they were mature adults. It was not a reward. It was a restoration of the security their parents had tried to gamble away. About a month after the house was sold, Clara came to see me. She appeared at my door unannounced, looking thinner, tired, but with a clarity in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. She was no longer playing a part. She didn't try to make excuses. She stood on my doorstep and with tears streaming down her face, she apologized. It was a raw, broken, and deeply sincere apology for the ultimatum, for her blindness, for her weakness, and for the pain she had caused. "I don't know how I let it happen, Dad," she wept, her shoulders shaking. "He twisted everything and I let him. I was so desperate to believe in the life he was selling me that I was willing to sell out the most important person in my life. I am so sorry." It was the conversation I had been waiting for, the one I wasn't sure would ever come. Forgiveness wasn't a simple switch to be flipped. The wound was deep. But looking at my daughter, stripped of the pretense and the poison that Mark had fed her, I saw the child I had raised. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I offered her a foundation to rebuild upon, but one she had to build herself. I helped her find a small, respectable apartment, co-signing the first year of the lease. I gave her a modest sum to get back on her feet, framing it as an advance on her inheritance to be accounted for later. There would be no more blank checks. The bank of Dad was permanently closed. The lesson had to stick. The months that followed were quiet and marked by a slow, fragile healing. Clara got a new, less glamorous but more stable marketing job. She began seeing a therapist. She focused all her energy on being a mother to Ava and Noah, providing them with the stability and attention they had been missing. Our relationship began to mend, one tentative step at a time. It started with phone calls, then coffee, and eventually my regular visits with the grandchildren were restored. But they were different. Now there was a new appreciation in Clara's eyes when I arrived. A quiet gratitude for my presence, not my presence. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after that fateful dinner, I was at the park with Ava and Noah. Ava was flying down the slide, her laughter echoing in the cool air, while Noah was determinedly trying to push me on the swing. I looked over and saw Clara sitting on a nearby bench just watching us. She wasn't looking at her phone or distracted by anything else. She was just watching her children play with their grandfather, and she was smiling. It wasn't the wide, performative smile from her social media posts, but a small, genuine smile of contentment. She caught my eye and gave me a simple nod, a gesture that conveyed a world of understanding. In that quiet moment, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I hadn't won a battle, I had restored an order. The structure I had deconstructed had been built on a rotten foundation. Now, on the cleared ground, something smaller, humbler, but far more honest was beginning to grow. Justice had been served, my family was safe, and my relationship with my grandchildren was finally priceless again.